And I want to thank everyone for coming. My name is Michael Simpson. I'm the co-director of the Center for Community Resilience and Climate Preparedness, and we are putting this on. We're based at Antioch University, New England, but we're just one of the 5 campuses of the university. So I'm pleased to introduce Bill Groves, Chancellor of the University System, who's going to officially welcome you for the university.
Of the good kind, although you're locked in a room for the entire day. We're going to go from winter to spring, and then tomorrow spring to summer. So you've got that to look forward to. So welcome to the 2018 Preparedness Conference. This is the 3rd conference that Antioch has presented of this nature in the last several years. And I think we have about 290 registrants, so a great turnout and an amazing conference. For those of you who were able to participate yesterday, there were workshops, and I understood those went very well, and I expect that you'll have a great day today. I'd especially like to thank our federal partners. We've done this in conjunction with federal partners at the US EPA in the past, and this year with NOAA. So I'd like to thank David Herring and his team from NOAA for their collaboration in this event and helping to make this possible. I'd also like to thank several of our foundation donors who have made travel grants available for participants in the event, and those include the Bay and Paul Foundations, the Town Creek Foundation, and the High Meadow Fund. Many who are in attendance today would not have been able to attend without their generosity, so if you could please give them a round of applause. In addition, we have many program sponsors. I think their names will be scrolling behind me. You'll find their names as well in some of the printed materials. As a result of their generosity, we're able to keep the registration fees to a minimum. And so again, if you would please thank them for their sponsorship of the program. Finally, I'd like to thank the faculty of Antioch University, New England, who with the steering committee helped put together this program through many hours of collaboration and thinking about what topics you would want to hear about over the next couple of days, bringing in some wonderful speakers who you will be hearing from. So again, thanks to the faculty and the steering committee for their efforts here. Antioch University has a long history and heritage of being a progressive institution in higher education. Our New England campus is one of 5 of our 5 campuses. We have campuses in Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, Seattle, Ohio, and Keene, New Hampshire. The university started in 1852 as Antioch College in Ohio. Its first president was Horace Mann, and Horace Mann was a visionary. He is, of course, the father of public education in the United States, and if you think that's something we can take for granted, in his time in the 1850s, public education was as much a battlefield as universal health care is today. But he knew that public education was the bastion of a democracy and fought for that before he came to Antioch University. At one of his first commencement speeches, he remarked to his graduates, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." And that has been our motto since, with a mission to educate students and preparing them to engage in the world, in climate as well, but to seek social justice, environmental justice, and economic justice wherever they may land. So thank you for being part of that mission here with the conference today. It's now my pleasure and honor to introduce the mayor of Manchester, New Hampshire. She's been mayor only since November's election, but before that she had been in public service here in the area, both on the Board of Education and as an alderman, and has worked for lower taxes, better schools, and better police forces. So if everyone would give a warm hand to Joyce Craig, Mayor of New Hampshire.
Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and welcome to Manchester. As you know, Manchester was once the home of the largest textile manufacturing plant in the world. Today, we've transitioned from the era of textiles to one of technology and higher education, and we're working very hard to make our city a more sustainable place. Manchester has made progress in recognizing and addressing the fact that climate change is happening. Whenever Manchester's Environmental Protection Division begins a major project, the engineers are required to address how climate change will impact the project. We're installing high-velocity catch basins and larger drainage pipes to handle the rain events of today. We're also committed to clean energy. The city has transitioned from oil to natural gas, and we utilize the Smart Start program to convert fluorescent lighting to LED. In the next few months, we'll be issuing an RFQ for a large solar array project on the former landfill site on the west side. One of the first things I did when I became mayor in January, not too long ago, was sign on to become a member of the Climate Mayors. Collectively, we oppose the proposed... It's an important group, and collectively we oppose the proposed repeal of the Clean Power Plan, which would put our citizens at risk and harm our efforts to address the urgent threat of climate change. We will continue to find new opportunities to push us forward to be better, to do more for ourselves and our future generations. In Manchester, we must think big and be open to transformative projects, renewable energy initiatives, and the development of a thriving and lively river walk. No one is insulated from the impacts of climate change. I hope that you enjoy your time at this conference as you strive to create healthy and resilient communities that are better able to handle severe weather and climate impacts. Enjoy the sun today and have a wonderful time.
So, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Suzanne Mosier. Susie is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in climate change communication, adaptation, and the interface between policy and science. She's director and principal researcher of Suzanne Mosier and Consulting in Santa Cruz, California, and is a social science research fellow at Stanford University's Woods Institute for the Environment. Susie contributed to both the fourth and fifth reports of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She was the review editor for the UN's IPCC Special Report on Extreme Events, Disaster Risk Management and Adaptation. And she is also a member of the Federal Advisory Committee for the third US National Climate Assessment, has led, co-led, or contributed to all the regional assessments around the country. So please welcome Susie Mosier.
Good morning, everyone. It's a wonderful day to be here with you on May 1st. A shout out for Labor Day. I want to start out my talk on hope in darkening times with a little bit of gratitude. It begins just because it's been probably a dozen or so years of conversations about hope with my partner in thought and life, Carol Berzonsky, and many of you in the room and many others not here who have been asking me again and again, how do we keep hope up in these times? It's basically got me talking and thinking and reading about hope for all these years. And on top of that, I want to thank Krista and the organizers for inviting me to this. Krista found apparently some talk I've given about hope before and thought, you could do that here again, please. Well, and I said, sure, happy to do that. That was, I don't know, Krista, when was it? 3, 4, 5 months ago? Well, one thing I can tell you about hope, it's a pretty fickle thing. I said yes enthusiastically, and then I kind of fell into a hope myself. And I thought, well, that's going to be tough. So I've been spending a lot of time trying to regain and refine my own hope and reading about hope. And this is just the most recent batch of things I've been ingesting, shall we say. And the honest truth is that when was it? On Sunday, when I started to come over from California, I didn't have a talk together for you. So what do? Well, flew into Hartford and drove up through Worcester, Massachusetts, and that's when my talk came together. And you wonder, what in the world? Well, I remember that in the early 1990s, this woman, Reverend Barbara Merritt of the First Unitarian Church in Worcester at the time, once said to me, despair would be easy. And I thought, well, there's my thought. That's what brings it all together. I'm going to tell you in the next half hour, whatever I have, about how hard hope is. How many reasons we have to fall into despair. And I'm going to close, hopefully, with actually something very promising. There are things we can all do. It's hard work to do, but we can actually foster hope and retain hope and come back to hope. And actually, that's why I'm standing in front of you today. So let me just start in with why despair would be easy. And I'm going to start with IPCC, the last assessment, which is now quite outdated. I can tell you, I can promise you, it's not going to be better when the 6th assessment comes out, or more recent, before that even, the report on 1.5 degrees that I was involved in shaping, at least in the beginning. So this is one of the things that the 4th assessment said to us, that the impacts that we're expecting are severe, pervasive, and irreversible. Now that's, quite a bit to take in. Probably many of you have seen this many times. It's gotten stronger ever since the IPCC has been working on it. I put on the side there the sequence of assessments over the years. In fact, if we do nothing else besides everything we have already done, right, all the things that probably got you as exhausted as me, then we're going to see warming on this planet between 3.7 and 4.8 Celsius, or almost 7, almost 9 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. That is on the order of magnitude of the warming, as you all know, since the Ice Age. So just in 100 years, not 10,000 years. And we have all the indications that things are actually happening faster than we thought. This is just one example I'm giving you here with the sea ice. You see basically on the left there the projections of what it could be under different emission scenarios. And then you see the black line, which is what's actually happening, and it is south of the worst of the emission scenarios. So it's going faster. And it has a lot to do with the feedback systems that are in place on our planet. We also have this, right, that sea level rise is faster than what we know. People are living with it. If you were here yesterday and saw that amazing documentary from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, you'd be surprised how many people drive through this much of water on a daily basis by now. And this is just the beginning of it. This is just after, 7, 8, 9 inches of sea level rise over the last century. And the curves are all pointing up. And in fact, we have been spending all our time over the last 20 years or so on that, what I call the luxury end of the exponential curve, the flat part. We're now getting into the part where things come faster and faster and faster. And then there's constantly this kind of news, particularly for those of us who work on coastal issues concerning, but you all should be concerned, because if any of this happens, none of the rest of us will in any way be unaffected by the impacts on coastal areas, given that it's where most of us live, it's where most of the economy is, and so on and so forth. The news that many of you know is that by now it's a luxury to think we might get away with 3 feet of sea level rise, which I read in the program. Jennifer is here, Jennifer Gerardo. That's the kind of 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise by 2060 is what they're planning on In Florida, and like I said, that is maybe outdated. We might very well expect 8 feet. In California, because of particular constellations in the Earth system, we're looking at 10 feet possibility by 2100. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. For me, this is very difficult to grasp, but it is billions of people. This is moving everyone, essentially. Let me make this a little bit more clear for you. I want to introduce to you Willie Boe. Willie Boe was recently introduced into our family, extended family, born about a month and a half ago. And he is a big baby. He weighed an enormous amount. He's many, many inches long already. It's the kind of guy you expect to be 6 feet when he's 18. All right, so let's just assume that for a moment. When he's 82 years old, it's supposed to be 6 feet or more. Could be as much as that. That's in his lifetime. To me, this is beyond comprehension. The only way I can possibly make that real and personal and meaningful is to think that he will be under the water in one way or another. And then there's this, right? In terms of the experiences we already have. Drought, storms, sea level rise, losing homes to loss of sea ice. I come from California. We have heat, drought, heavy rains, floods, mudslides. Oh, did I forget the fires? The fires in between. That's the sequence we usually go through. I can tell you it's changed the conversation in California very recently. But this is what we already see now. This is with barely a degree of warming. That's where we are. So we've been misnaming climate change for a very long time. It's not just change, this neutral, sanitized thing. When it comes to us, it will be loss of health, loss of life, home, livelihood, sense of place, social connection, loss of species, loss of diversity, habitats, landscapes, seasons, loss of life support systems, loss of sense of security, loss of certainty, loss of well-being, loss of trust in the future, loss of who we think we are, and maybe loss of hope. So that is the reality that we are going increasingly into. This is one version of reading Darkening Times. Now, I want to bring you a couple of statistics as to whether Americans think that way. To me, this is both inklings of hope, but also reason for more easy despair, if you will. What you see here is the question that Tony Lazarowitz and Ed Maybach at Yale and George Mason have been asking for a long time now, which is, how worried are you about this? And what I want you to basically pay attention to is this gradual increase. That's all you need to know. And this piece, which is, of those, the red part is people who say they're very worried. That has doubled over 8 years, 10 years, something like that. Whereas the other one has just been creeping up slowly, but that's an important piece of this story. So, good. We should be getting more worried, and it's very appropriate in light of the experiences that I just showed you about. Now, the other part then is, okay, so why are we not doing anything? And in fact, this is a question that I think is really important for all of us to hear. Pay attention. I'll make it, by pointing to it, and I'll read to you what these say, because it's, I bet you, very hard to read from way back there. So this question basically is, which of the following comes closest to your view? Humans could reduce global warming, but it's unclear at this point whether we will do what's necessary. I would call those the doubters. Half of the Americans doubt that we will actually manage to do that. The next one, 22% say humans could reduce global warming, but people aren't willing to change their behavior, so we're not going to. I would call them the cynics. Then we have humans can't reduce global warming even if it's happening. Complete fatalism, 15% almost. And then there's the denial. Global warming isn't happening, so what are you all worried about? But that together gives us 94% of the American public who has some degree of doubt that we will actually deal with it. About 6% think, yep, we can and we will. 6%. That's probably not the people who you most deal with in your daily work. Now, if they're getting more worried, and if they're really doubtful that we can do anything about it, there is one psychological reaction that people have to that. When a risk becomes unmanageable, people go into the sand with their heads first. If you cannot stop the experience of risk by interfering with the risk and mitigating that risk, you will mitigate the feeling of being at risk, of feeling at risk. You will basically go into a form of denial, of going numb, tuning it out, which is probably a huge reason behind why people do not act on their worry. This is what we know, how people respond, right? All kinds of feelings, from being bored to tears, to being, affected obviously by disasters, overwhelmed, shouting at each other, all of which is complete turnoff. This is the emotional landscape that many of you encounter on a regular basis in your daily work. Increasingly, you hear people talk about PTSD, particularly this year, post-traumatic stress disorder, panic attacks, people who are just now sitting in Puerto Rico and counting down the days before hurricane season officially begins again, because their roofs have still not been fixed since last time it was taken off. Now, what do we know about the emotional response of Americans? I just, again, want to point out a few things that stand out. About 45%, nearly half, say they feel it's somewhat or very helpless. They don't know what to do. A little more say they're disgusted by probably any number of forms of discussions about it. If you're disgusted from something, what do? Do you rush in and change it, or do you withdraw from it? Most people have actually a tendency to withdraw from disgust as opposed to stepping in and changing the disgust into something lovely, right? And then there is people, this is a little tricky to read this particular graphic because the range of emotions vary in valence, and so on the right-hand side is, are you hopeful, not very, or not at all? 55% say they're not hopeful at all. Now, it's not clear whether this is about how we deal with the impacts or whether that's about how we deal with the emissions, but basically that is some of the landscape: anger, fear, outrage, interest. All of those are there too, so don't assume everyone feels exactly the same. But those are important indicators as to why people are not maybe deeply engaged in this conversation, which brings me then to the question of, well, isn't there enough to be hopeful? I mean, one thing that we are seeing increasingly is any number of these things, from individual action to community action to job creation to collective action, social movements. I mean, those are the forces that create change. And you'd say, well, shouldn't we be hopeful? Well, it's probably a good thing to return for a moment to IPCC and when it says how big the challenge actually is. If we want to have a better than 2 out of 3 chance to stay under that guardrail of 2 degrees, which many people do not believe is a safe guardrail, but let's just go with that for the moment. We need to keep concentrations of CO2 equivalents, if you will, down below 450 parts per million. Right now we're at 404 or so. That means in 32 years from now, we have to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from anything we do anywhere between 40 to 70%, and down to 0 or less, meaning we actually start to suck more CO2 out of the atmosphere by 2100. That is when Willie Boe is 82. Now, that in my mind is a complete blood transfusion of the society. And I want to put this into the context of a few other pieces of data that you may or may not have at your fingertips. So this baseline of let's not do anything, let's just continue business as usual, will get us warming in the range of 4 4.8 degrees Celsius. Now, there are studies that have looked at, what might a 4-degree world look like, and they've essentially come collectively to the conclusion that a civil society as we know it, a civilization as we know it, cannot exist under the conditions that would prevail on Earth if we had 4 degrees of warming. North of 4 degrees, the things that we now have, like infrastructure, economies, governments, peace somewhat, that will not exist at 4 degrees. Just not the conditions for the kind of life that we want to have. Now, if you compare that to all the policies currently on the table that people are already enacting, from local level, state level policy, national level policies, we might get ourselves somewhere in the range of 3.1 to 3.7. That's, for my comfort, awfully close to that 4-degree line. Especially since people are now saying that 2 degrees isn't exactly safe anymore. But anyway, that's progress, right? If you compare that to the pledges, this is status November 2017, so does not yet include, I believe, the withdrawal, because that was in, no, it does include. Trump withdrew in June. So November 2017 includes the withdrawal of the US. So when you compare that to what people are pledging to do under the Paris Agreement, gets us anywhere between 2.5 and 3.2 degrees. And that is still this far away from the 2 degrees. Or if you go a little bit further south to the green line here, that's more closer to 1.5 to 350 parts per million that Jim Hansen and others talk about. Now, what's important about that green and yellow portion is that it starts to bend down today. Everything else is leading to what we call overshoot, and we will have to do more drastic measures and do active extraction of CO2 out of the atmosphere to get us back down, these so-called negative emissions technologies, all of which are something that we now bank on as if that was the insurance that we have. So, okay, have I depressed you enough? It's almost over, okay? Almost, not quite, it's almost over. This is how people respond to this kind of news. I love to use a poem for this one. Jane Hirschfeld said, when his ship first came to Australia, Cook wrote, the natives continued fishing without looking up, unable, it seems, to fear what was too large to be comprehended. I don't know if any of you know this poem, but it's called Global Warming. That's kind of how we are. We just continue fishing because it's kind of too big. And let me just say one last thing about how big. I call that the transformation imperative. So let's take this goal. To reach the goal of the Paris Accord to stay below 2, we need that blood transfusion that I mentioned. Basically turning everything we do in the next 50 to 80 years onto non-CO2 sources of energy. And that means, along with that, a fundamental restructuring of the globalized economy, profound changes to how we live our lives, how we think about consumption, what we actually do. I cannot think of anything more demanding on the governance institutions that we have to bring that about. Because it's not going to come through, everyone changing their little light bulbs. This is going to need massive governance support to bring about. And then, of course, at 2 degrees, we still have a pretty large amount of adaptation, but compared to what might come otherwise, it's moderate in what we have to do in adaptation. The alternative is we miss the Paris Accord, go to 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees of warming, and at that point, we will have extensive, rapid climate changes, catastrophes, global shifts in market, production sides, probably complete collapse of that, massive migration of people, attempts to adapt, because we're not going to just sit by, but it's going to be incredibly difficult to pull that off, and highly unpredictable consequences of climate change and of adaptation efforts in all areas and sectors of society. neither one of these versions we will get away without transformative change. Not just tweaking a little bit here and changing a little bit here. It is massive. Now, between that, you recognize there's something else. We're not going to just sit there, right? We're already not just sitting there. But we might very well miss that 2-degree window we might want to avoid because of what we will experience the world of 3, 4, and 5 degrees. So we will have more extensive climate changes and catastrophes coming more frequently at the same time that we need to upscale our emission reduction efforts, have adaptation efforts, and probably we will geoengineer on top of that. Just in case it wasn't complex enough for you yet, we will even do more. And again, the complexity of that, politically, legally, I want to say militarily, socially, in any one of these ways, is just as transformative as any of the 2 other worlds. There is no other way besides transformation that I have come across. So, probably how you feel right now. You would probably not want me to talk, talk about all these things. We all have these defenses against it. And I want to walk you very briefly through how we typically handle that, and that might explain a little bit why the American people handle things the way they do. It starts with this. I don't want to think about this. Can we go over to something else? Can we flip the channel? You basically keep things at a long arm. You keep it at a distance, what we call psychological distance, and it basically, if you succeed, it helps you to not think or feel about whatever it is, this discomforting news that you have. Now, let's just say it's just coming at you and you can't avoid it. Well, if you let it in, then you run smack on into the next layer of defense. And I'm using here the words or the phrases of a psychologist from Norway, Parasis Stoknes, who came up with these, and I think that it's actually the best summary of a lot of social psychology and other forms of science that we know. The next defense basically is you don't want to feel doom and gloom. None of us do, right? So not feeling the loss, not feeling the grief is the next thing we tend to do. And people will go to great length to essentially push back on having to feel the sad news, the grief, the fear of what's involved in that. Now let's just for a minute assume that you actually are allowing that. And I would say in general, we lack the prowess and the cultural institutions to make space for that. There is here and there now climate anxiety and climate grief groups popping up. I find that super exciting actually and significant for this culture. But in America, you don't grieve publicly. Someone dies, in 3 days you're back for work, right? That's how we deal with grief, and that's how it is. You got hit by a hurricane, you lost your livelihood, get back up on your feet and do it. It's incredibly difficult if you imagine we keep having more and more of these that we have no capacity at the moment to really support people in that grief and get through that constructively. PTSD, I showed that to you earlier, is headline news now. That's where we are. Let's imagine you allowed yourself. You had some kind of friends or partner or whatever who lets you feel your grief about what's happening, not just to you personally, but to the planet. The next thing that would do is you would want to act on it. If you cannot just sit by, that's not what humans do. When you feel something like that, you feel like you need to act on it. But when people don't know what to do, when they find it very uncomfortable or when the solution isn't one that they like, the next thing they do is they don't act on it. They want to, but they don't. And they experience cognitive dissonance. But nobody wants to feel guilty. This is when we start to get into amazing attacks on the people with the bad news, amazing, resistance that you experience. This is a lot of where the dismissive and the doubtful and the professionally doubtful come from, because they don't want to feel all these things. Imagine for a minute you just say, I just need to act on this. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it anyway. The next thing that happens is if you did that, but none of your friends, none of your colleagues, none of your family members, none of your neighbors did the same, you would find yourself socially isolated, which evolutionarily speaking is a death thing. I mean, that's just a death sentence to not be part of your tribe. We go to amazing lengths at that point to deny that there is anything we ought to, be worried about. This is the deepest, or some of the deepest denial that happens, because we do not want to lose our social ties or respect and standing in front of our peers. And then finally, you might say, I'm going to do it, even if they don't want me to. I'm going to act on it. And at that point, you're going to be confronted with possibly having to do something that does not jive with who you are as a person. Complete break. I can give you a whole number of examples of these are the kinds of people we love to tell stories about, people who changed who they were as a result of finally coming around, being convinced of it. But we don't do that like every other Tuesday. This, changing of who we are fundamentally, that might happen if you're lucky once in your lifetime. This is a really fundamental thing, and if you take that now from the individual to a collective, this is where America might have to change what it thinks of itself. Yesterday we went through these long lists of typical values associated with, liberals versus conservatives. All of us might have to shift our identities and affiliations with our groups in terms of how we think about how we're going to go through this transformation. So that's where the challenge comes in. Well, it does feel impossible, doesn't it, to get that done on a global level? I like this guy. This is the turning point of the conversation. It always seems undoable, impossible, until it is actually done. Now, what we do as an adaptation community, as a mitigation community, as people building resilience, I'll put them right now here into one pot, is that we have focused increasingly on building our prowess in the technical tasks. How do we assess risks of climate change? How do we plan implementation, including the legal and financial barriers you're going to be hearing about today? Stakeholder engagement and communication, that's the kind of stuff that we train ourselves in. And that's really important, and I'm very, very, very glad that you're all doing that, because if we all were on our own having to figure this out, we would be slowed down. This is an incredibly important event to help us learn with each other and thereby accelerate what we're doing. And it's important we learn with each other, because look at some of the stuff we've been doing that's not quite up to the task. These are not cartoons, these are actual things that you could see. We just inform people about the risks and go home. Or we spray paint the grass in California green, because we can't have green lawns there anymore. Or put black balls on water so it doesn't evaporate so we don't go dry, or we just put covers on ice. These are photographs of things we do right now. Now, I'll ask you, is that going to come up to the transformative challenge? Thank God we do a lot of other things. I give you these examples that range from the most amazing technical issues, like building plugs for tunnels or making water usable after we use it once already, restoring floodplains, putting houses on stilts, beach nourishment, floodgates. In the middle there, some rather creative, living bubbles with solar panels to feed it. So we are starting to, get really good and inventive around these things. And I want to say one of these inventions is that in politically difficult times, we also now just talk about resilience. And I want to point this out because it's a really important one, and it's an important element of where we are in this moment. There are people, this is from a sign, I think in New Orleans, that says, "Stop calling me resilient," because every time you do, "Oh, they're resilient," that means you do something else to me, or I'm not resilient. It means we are actually now bringing the equity issues into the conversation front and center, which is a really important development. Adaptation, resilience building will never be enough if we just do it for the privileged few. It will not suffice. So this, in my mind, is beginning to be transformative, that we are actually thinking about equity. But I want you to understand that I think if we want to get people through this hard time, what we have to do is a lot bigger There is a human task here. And I hope that in all of what we're going to talk about at this conference, we're actually going to come in again and again thinking about how do we meet people in their fears and worries about change. And it could be the change that is associated with climate change or the change that is associated with the policy or the change in practice that we do associated with adaptation. Reaching people behind their defenses, tapping into people's need and desire for hope, engaging them in actually not just coming along, but creating that future in very effective ways. And then I want to say, facing that transformation in ourselves. Because while you all are working with your communities and you have to support all of them, you are going to be affected just as much. So it's an internal and external human task that we need to accomplish at the same time. So let me tell you what I've learned in all that reading about hope. It's a really interesting and long list. Psychology has written quite a bit about it. In fact, it's an interesting source. Medical psychology is one of the most interesting areas that I've come across that has thought a lot about how do you give people hope when they're really seriously ill, maybe even terminally ill. You can learn a ton about it, and I'll come back to that at the end. So in their mind, attitude could be anything from an attitude of mind to a way to maintain personal motivation, a cognitive skill, a mechanism, motivational attribute, or a force. Not exactly everyone agrees, but you get the idea. It's mostly in your head. Well, in the health field, they talk about it, and they basically have real empirical data that show if you're hopeful, you're more likely to be healthy or to become healthy again after you've been sick. So it's something that affects you physiologically to become healthy or healed. In economics, they have talked about this. They think of hope as the result of empowerment. Very different notion of hope. And then there's the philosophers who have a lot to say about it, and I want to almost include the theologians in this one as well. It's not quite the same, of course, but there it ranges from anything from a meta-narrative to a prerequisite of getting to spiritual attainment, an extension of suffering, interestingly, or a moral duty. My God, what do you do with like these 17 definitions? And I'm only giving you a small portion of what I've been reading. So again, I find it quite helpful to think of that in a slightly more simplistic way. I'm going to walk you through 5 kinds, and in this case here I'm drawing again on Stokeness, but also on an anthropologist named Jonathan Lear, who has written about hope as well. The first flavor of hope is passive optimism, or what he calls Pollyanna hope. This is Stokeness. Passive optimism. There's 2 pieces to that that are really important. The passive part is that you don't have to do anything about it, and the optimism part is that the outcome is assured. It will happen, whatever you desire, and I don't have to do anything about it. We're fine. That's Pollyanna hope, okay? Are we going to get through what I'm telling you about with that? Probably not. There is another form of being convinced that the outcome is going to be good, but one where people feel more engaged. I have to help a little bit. And that is heroic hope. There is a role for me in making sure that this one fabulous outcome that I wish for actually comes about. And there is a different combination of the two, of the attitudinal stance, if you will, and the outcome orientation. That is passive skepticism or stoic hope. Probably you know some people like that. I don't feel convinced at all that something good is going to come. In fact, it could be quite bad, but I'm going to be tough. I'm going to get through this. That's stoic hope, right? And then you're not going to be surprised. Here comes grounded hope or active skepticism, which is essentially the idea that I am not at all convinced that tomorrow is going to be better than today, that we're going to get what we want. But I cannot get up in the morning, look in the mirror, and be fine without putting my shoulder toward that wheel. That is grounded hope. Not being convinced that the outcome is positive and still working on it. Now, I found this enlightening, but it wasn't quite enough after I read this book by Jonathan Lear called Radical Hope. And I just called it active transformation. What he means by radical hope is that you don't know that the outcome is going to be good or bad, or whether or not it's going to come about. You don't even necessarily know what you can do. And you don't eventually even know what is good, right, or wrong anymore. You have to fundamentally change the way you think about the future, your means, your ends, all the pieces. It's an amazing book. I cannot recommend it highly enough if you haven't read it already. It seems dated. I think it's completely timeless. It's my Bible, anyway, as to what will get us to the transformative task. And it suggests something so profound about how we need to change our own way of thinking about what might come and what I think is the right way to get there. And if we don't know the right way, then maybe we can actually sit down with each other and listen to each other again and do the hard work of not just the transformation, but establishing and maintaining hope. So I want to offer you this image for a really helpful way of depicting hope. If you think about rowers in a boat, first of all, there's not just one, they do it together. Very important. But which way are they going? This way, into your audience, or behind this wall? Yeah, and they're all sitting with the back toward the future. They have an idea of where they want to go, but they don't see it clearly. It's not they're riding into the future with a clear picture, right? We sit with our back to it, hoping, and we put our entire force, collective force behind it to get there. And interestingly enough, we look toward the past. Why is that important? Because we can learn 1,000 things from the past about how does change really happen. And I want to say to you, throw away every history book that you have known and ask very deep questions about how that really happened. Was that a straight shot? Did someone just walk into the battlefield wanting, the world changed? Or was that a really crooked, complex way of getting about change? We're not going to get to this future, whatever, some livable, dignified future, with a straight path. We might hope for it, but we look to learn from everything around us, everything we've done so far, to think about hope. And so this is why I came up with this definition. I'll read it to you because you can't read it back there. My definition of hope is standing on an ever-changing foundation of uncertainty and change. Hope arises from the tension between a deep understanding of history and a bold vision of an unwritten future. It's a motivation experienced in the present combined with an ability to see far and a commitment to contribute constructively to building it. Now that's complex. I broke that down for you into this. 3 things that you all need to think about. A desirable future, agency, how do we make that happen? And constantly presence of uncertainty. If you were convinced that we could make it happen, if you were convinced that, we're doomed, you don't need hope. That's not hope. Hope is if the future isn't written, right? Only because it's not written, we have a chance in darkening times to still make a difference. What do we want? How do we get there? And constantly being aware of and embracing uncertainty as a source, as opposed to a scary thing. And I want to say more concrete things. What do we do around a desirable future? Well, listening to others. What do you want? I come back to that in a moment. Visioning, expanding the circle. Maybe you're only talking to 3 people and, that's kind of getting boring and you can't really think far enough. Maybe you need to expand the circle of who's around. Inviting creativity, fostering imagination. I think our imagination in this country is completely shot. We just don't even have enough of an idea of both how bad and how good it could get. In all the work I've been doing, I'm always surprised of how stuck we are to thinking just in the next just slightly expanded from what we already know. So if you get stuck there, there's this beautiful phrase, the adjacent possible. Push toward the adjacent possible. Go as far as you already have always gone, and then push to the adjacent possible, both in the threats, but also in the possibilities. What's possible beyond what we always think we can do? Setting the bar higher. Maybe if it's not high at all, set it high to begin with. Around agency, what can you do? Well, I showed you all the people who don't know that we can do something, who don't know how that is. I basically have stopped talking about climate change alone. People need to know how social change happened, not how climate change happened. And this is where history comes in, where we need to learn from history, showing how telling personal stories, teaching and learning about history, illustrating what actually works in collective action, and encouraging and empowering people to do that. For each one, there's volumes of things we could say, and I'll come back to a little recipe for you, but this is a really important element of what people need to hear far more than just the threats. You can see that in this thing, I don't have climate change in there. This is about what do we want, how do we get there, and then how do we embrace this uncertainty? Well, I think we should all expect that everything's going to change. Expect to be surprised. All of our imaginations are limited. But we can reflect, we can learn, we have to, when we have big goals, breaking them down into smaller ones, when people make narrow goals, make them bigger, blast them open, ask questions about how change happened, track progress. It's a really important way to know whether anything that you think is working is actually working. And expect variation in emotion. I want to say that too, and that is the explanation for why, when Krista said, could you do this, and I said enthusiastically yes, and then I didn't have a talk for you all this time. It's because hope is not this steady thing. It's not going to just, you get it once and then that's it. You constantly rework and regain it, and you lose it, and you suffer, and you are exhausted, and you are sad and angry and whatnot, and then you come back to, why am I really here, right? So I want to come back to actually asking, what do people want from resilience? And I think that's a really important thing. You might have all an idea, and I bet you don't all agree on what you want to have outcome. Maybe we could collectively create a vision. But one of the things that I found is that for a lot of people, it actually is about making things better than they are right now. They're already not in a great place, and they see resilience as an opportunity to improve on their lives. And when you see these kinds of things, you think, yeah, I get it. But for many others, it's keeping what we have. Either because they're privileged and they want to keep that, or because it's actually pretty darn good, and people want to keep that. And then there's people who are already on the edge of what they can sustain, and they want a dignified way out. Essentially, if I can't keep any of that, what I have, I can't make it better, then what is my next best thing? And what's behind that is, it's a sort of chronological sequence, but it's also a variation among people, and you will need to negotiate with your people what you can agree on. So this is one way to actually come back to what it means to create a vision. Well, ask the people that you work with where they are and what needs to be improved, what needs to be kept. How do we get out in a way that is respectful of people who have to leave the places where they live, who have to get out of professions they can no longer maintain. Very difficult work. I want to introduce you very quickly, and I have very few copies of this document here. I was involved with my colleagues Joyce Coffey and Aleka Seville in a report that we wrote for the Kresge Foundation called Rising to the Challenge, Together, I emphasize. It's really the most important part for me, the whole thing. In which we put forward a vision for the adaptation field, which is basically that we as a profession will have the capacity to close the resilience gap by reducing emissions, reducing the causes of climate change, and preparing for the impacts, and doing that on a bedrock of creating social cohesion, drawing on social cohesion, and creating more equity. And in that, I just want to say, we have tons of recommendations for what any number of you, whether you're in government, in foundations, in research institutions, what you can do. If you don't want to read the whole thing, the executive summary is pretty darn good. And the appendices, which you can only get online, have the detailed recommendations for what every one of us can do to help contribute, build a field that's able to do that. We wouldn't be able to fight AIDS if we didn't have public health. We wouldn't have the ability to get rid of, Ebola or any number of other public health threats if we didn't have a clear purpose for why we're coming together, the people that can do it, the practices that actually enable us to do it, and the pillars of support, meaning the funding and the policy environment in which we can do that. That is what we need for adaptation. This is one vision of how we all can contribute to that. What it means in any one community, you can work out with the people you work, but this framework that we offer here might help. And because we don't have a ton of time, let me say something about a particular set of strategies we might embrace. These are strategies that have to do with acceleration of what we do. Because we're doing great things. Many things are really, really good. But we can't just dabble. We are, as this curve behind it shows, still on the luxury end, and we're moving just now into this place. It is coming faster. We have to think bigger. So just doing your own little thing is maybe not enough. And it begins often with reframing. Many of us work on similar things, on related things. How can we do all of what we do, put that together under a bigger frame of working toward a larger goal together? Reframing is the first task of acceleration. If we just keep going with what we do, we might not get there. Then comes the question of, okay, how do we replicate it? That's what we call scaling out. How can we make more of what we do happen? I think a professional society like ASAP, you're going to hear from them, that is a really important way of helping to build the capacity that we can do vulnerability assessments in a lot of places. But we also need maybe the professional standards because we can't be in 1,000 places at once. So what are the professional standards for a group like ourselves to move forward? Scaling up is the kind of stuff that we talk about when we talk about policy change. It affects, at a higher level, affects what the rest of us do. How can we move, even in this environment, more effectively at getting the right policies in place to move us? And scaling deep is the idea that you find out just scaling up and scaling out doesn't do the trick. You often have to dig deeper and get at the cultural norms and the underlying strategies, underlying beliefs to keeping us doing what we do. So really coming back together, however often we do that, and thinking deeply about, is it enough? What do we need to change at a deeper level, at the cultural norm level? That needs to happen. Doing integration, we have tracks here. I always want to have them all mushed together. If you're doing infrastructure and you're not engaging, if you're doing infrastructure or financing and you're not doing equity, it's just not going to work. It's not going to be sufficient. So I want to say, invite you all, cross-pollinate as much as you can. That's acceleration work. Accelerating specifically as a strategy looks at what are the stumbling blocks, what are the adaptation barriers, and what specific thing can we do to overcome or reduce or eliminate that particular barrier. Could be any number of things, whether that's a regulation, a standard, or whatever it is. And then the last thing is that because it's constantly changing, we have to accelerate our ways of learning. Peer learning, learning in these kinds of environments, you name it. But the combination of these in the specific context in which you are, those are ways in which you can accelerate your agency to help with hope. And then this is about the embracing of uncertainty. None of us know how to do this really, right? We know a whole bunch. We are, standing experts in a lot of things, but you're going to get all kinds of data that point you in different directions. You're going to not know how to help yourself. The tool may not fit. The direction might not be the right one. It might change. This is the life we're now in. This is our environment. This is the water we all swim in. So, how do we deal with that? Well, this is a recipe I've drawn from, and this is my last slide. This is the ingredients that I have drawn from all that reading that I've done on the continual ingredients that you need. And it's not just one sequence. I put them here in a little web. There is some logic to going a particular sequence, but because hope is not a linear thing, you will go back and forth. It starts often with a clear-eyed diagnosis. It's the doctor that comes in and says, you do have cancer. Yeah, it's me coming in and saying, we are overshooting 2 degrees in like no time here. A clear-eyed diagnosis and told with empathy. You would never walk into, well, you shouldn't. And if you ever have such a doctor, dump him. If the doctor came in and told you this kind of bad news and didn't have some kind of empathy as he or she tells you the news, that's a bad doctor. And we as scientists have eliminated all feeling from anything that we ought to talk about. We need to prepare people for the bad news that we're bringing and share it with empathy and humanity. And then come up with, together with the patient, whatever that is in your case, with a vision of what's a worthwhile outcome. For a doctor that tells you that bad news, it might be, you know, we can cure that. Or, I have no idea whether we can cure that. We can give it a really good try, but we may not succeed, and you may die, but we can make that pain-free. We can make sure your family is with you, whatever, right? A vision of a worthwhile outcome right now might be one thing for climate change. It will change over time. It too, the outcome itself too, will change over time. And then help me see the path. What do we need to do? What's the treatment along the way to get from where we are right now to the future that we want? Feasible path means it's actually grounded in experience, grounded in understanding, in good organizing, in good technical understanding. So that's really important. And then the next important thing is that the person who is ill, the community that must adapt, the neighborhood, whatever the policymakers you're dealing with, that must be a meaningful role for them. And when I say meaningful, I don't mean just, you know, that it makes a big impact. I mean, is it meaningful to them? Because that will be the thing that sustains them, their deepest motivation. Many of us think it's got to be dollars and cents, and yes, that is often the first calculation. And there's a lot more that we can do about making that a lot more feasible. But the deepest motivations people find is in the call on the highest self. It is not these superficial, outcome-oriented, or just identity and esteem-oriented things. It's the deepest things that give someone meaning, that keeps them going. Another important piece is, what do we do when things work out? Oh, we can all go home now. It's not going to be going home. There is no one going home from this. What do we do when things are, you know, the interim goals are reached? How do we keep people with it? And how do we use that joy of achieving something? But also, what do we do when we get disappointed? There will be other trumps. There will be other fill in the blanks of what will be, who will be elected, things that don't work out. We have put our best effort forward with strategy and it's not working out. And then finally, if you tell a patient, you all just have to do this, and there's nothing that the doctor says about, I'm going to do this to help you, they're just on their own. So help the patient see how you and everyone around you is pulling on the same string, moving it forward together. These 7 ingredients are some that I've come across, and I use them all the time in my work. It actually does work. It is not a stable thing. You keep going back to what's the thread, what's the outcome, what's the vision, whatever. You keep going doing that. But those elements are always in the mix of creating hope. And so I want to just end my talk with as much gratitude as it began, which is to say, thank you for what you do. It does matter. Now let's work together to make it bigger. Thank you. Before the break to ask, for questions. I don't know, is there microphones that Or
No,
just
they just
shout
wanna
out?
stand up and-
Okay, stand up, introduce yourselves, and shout out if you have a question or comment. Kevin?
Kevin Roth from Boston. This was an American example. Do you draw any inspiration and hope from what's going on in other non-American examples, including non-democratic examples like China or?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was, I draw any American examples? Actually, I don't. My reading goes much further than that. But the question was, do I draw examples in other countries, China, or I don't know, I'm thinking Egypt, or any other number of revolutions? I do. Partly because I'm not American, so I'm not fully in command of the details of American history. So I draw a lot of my own. I read things of how people kept up hope. We were just talking about this morning with David about people living in or having to endure in concentration camps. So the foundations of existentialist psychology come in here. I draw on social movements, which, we have one small corner on that, right? But whether that's Europe or whether that's the Middle East or other places, certainly China, there are really interesting things. And, even in the field of innovation, you can draw on many, many other countries and examples. I think what's most powerful in my experience is that when you speak to the historical experiences and the really essential moments in a culture that combine us as, say, Americans in this case, that really works. I recently gave a talk in Europe and I drew a lot on what was going on there at the time, and I think it just resonates better with the audience to connect with their own deep roots. So I'd say, yes, let's learn from all of those places, but keep it grounded in whoever you're talking to. Yes?
So the 4 degrees, if I use that number, somebody's going to ask me to cite some examples. Could you give me an idea of some examples of what might happen should we hit the 4-degree mark?
So, yeah, the question was about the 4-degree mark and my comment that basically civilization does not persist under those circumstances. There was a conference at Oxford some years back on 4 degrees. And I think all the papers are still online. Lots of European folks involved in that. But actually, at the time, it was mostly climate scientists running models for, say, agriculture. What would happen with agriculture and the conditions for the growing conditions for the key things that we all live on. And basically maize, wheat, rice, all falter. And those are the most important things we all eat from or feed the meat that we basically then consume. So, it's just one example, but they ran it through other sectors of society. And if you look Oxford 4 degrees, you'll probably find all those citations. Any other comments, or is it just really coffee time? Yes, please.
Climate change is regarded as a global issue, which needs global effort. However, when you think about developing countries, the concern is how do they also get developed?
Yep.
Also pass through like the industrial revolutions to be able to get developed. And putting that in your illustration of closing the resilience gap, do you think it's possible to close this gap without the development component?
I think it's a really important question of basically the link between the right to development and moving out of poverty, in any dimension, public health threats, and combining that with the need for mitigation, adaptation, closing that resilience gap. I guess the framework that I mentioned about mitigation, adaptation on the bedrock of social cohesion and equity can be taken global. This is a framework that's broad enough to even involve that. And of course, that is at the heart of all the international negotiations going on right now in Bonn again of how to do that. I think, one of the key ways in which we're limited is that we pursue that at a very high governance level with a very set of governance structures, and quite frankly, with a limited set of imaginations about what development could mean. Does it all have to go the same path? Can it look really differently? And I think this is where I'm really encouraged and hopeful from what comes actually from a lot of bottom-up transformative experiments in many, many countries, in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, of where people really sit together and think up very different futures than the ones that are being discussed, whether it's Bonn, Paris, or any number of those places. So I think for the time being, I think we need to think of these as parallel efforts, bottom-up, top-down, and they both contribute to making the ultimate transformation. I think what I see as being hopeful is that there is revisioning of what an economy is about. I see revisioning of what well-being is defined as. And those kinds of, these kinds of ways of envisioning a different future might take us on a different path than just big technology, big finance, infusion of right now it's basically dumping a lot of the technology we think we can't use here anymore because of climate, and we're dumping it on developing countries, and I think that's just, criminal. So really rethinking how we do that with the involvement of the people who are actually affected by it is, in my mind, the more hopeful approach to this. Not to say we don't need the global negotiations, because that does set, very important messages and direction, but the how. Let them set the target. Let's work out the how with the people actually doing it and being affected by it. And I think that's also true in this country. Our format, our ways of thinking about development are incredibly narrow. There's only one way we can imagine an economy ought to look. It's always progress, always growth, always materially consumptive based. We made that up. We thought that up. Let's change that. One more. Yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I really appreciate your incorporation of the psychological and the emotional dimension. And I've been reading a book lately called The Body Holds the Score, and the connection of our physical self and our bodies to our emotional, our ability to connect to our emotions. And I'm curious if you've seen in any examples or any of the work that you've done, the incorporation of the physical body to engage people on climate change and to promote transformation.
Yeah, it's a great question about the involvement of our embodiment in resilience work. I see it mostly actually in the arts community. There is a growing cohort of psychologists who actually bring that recognition that we are actually integrated beings, not just heads on a stake, but heads in bodies. They bring it to it. There is a network growing called Transformational Resilience. That's a lot of human development, human service providers, psychologists working with not just trauma survivors after, let's say, climate disaster or something, but essentially bringing the insights from therapeutic clinical work into how do we keep up, essentially. And so I see that in a more not trauma-based context. I see it in the arts community, people doing dance, movement, whatever. And I have to say, they live in a slightly separate universe from the people, probably many of you in the room, working on financing and laws and regulations and whatnot, building stuff. And it's a sad state of where we are. I think we should seek each other out. When you only get the same old 14 people into your public meeting, can you make that more interesting? Can you make that more, creative? People tend to think better when they actually move their bodies. So maybe we shouldn't just all poo-poo that. Maybe that's that overlap between that circle of the technical task with the human task. I quite deliberately put them not off in separate bubbles. They ought to come closer and closer into alignment. Right now, there's the smallest overlap at all. So I totally hope that we see more of that. It's not happening on a big grand scale yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, we have a break. The sessions will start at 10 o'clock, and so our exhibitors and sponsors, and actually student posters. There's some good student posters in the exhibit hall too. So why don't you take a break, and we'll see you in the sessions.